The economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against the Republic of Cuba has been in place for 50 years, thus making 70% of Cubans born under this embargo.
The American trade embargo with Cuba is nearly 55 years old.
Alright guys, so the Cold War ended over 50 years ago. Fidel Castro is out of power. The Cuban economy is in the middle of transitioning to a more market-based economy. And the United Nations General Assembly in October 2013 once again voted in favor of removing the current trade embargo between the U.S. and Cuba by 182-2 vote. So, I'd like to talk about, should the trade embargo be eliminated, and would it help Cuba?
I completely agree. Currently, the United States imposes trade embargo on more than Cuba, more than one country. So, outweighing the proposition to lift up the trade embargo, what specifically stands out for Cuba for the trade embargo to be lifted up?
Okay, so exactly speaking, why I feel the trade embargo has to be lifted is the proximity of Cuba related to US. We are with strikingly small distance, so it's like we have a better logistic, supply chain management, and a lot of overhead costs would be reduced if we have if the US trade embargo is lifted. Another thing to make it clear is that the US the trade commerce of states recently announced that we are losing around 12 billion of our annual sale of exports due to Cuba, because that's a growing economy and we need to have some exports from it. And exactly speaking about the Hexion model, the Cuban cigar industry is a labor-intensive industry. So as you know, it's like US people really love the Cuban cigars. So why not? It's like when you have the more demand, that will escalate the price of Cuban cigars, and that means good for the economy of Cuba. And you have everything is eaten up by the demand in US.
I completely agree. We all love the Cuban cigars.
Now, Cuba is continuing to open up to the outside world. Its National Assembly has just passed a new law which is trying to encourage more foreign investment. Taxes on profits will be cut in half, from 30% to 15%. Well, the overall aim is to raise foreign direct investment to $2 billion a year to meet a growth target of 7%. And it's all part of Raul Castro's reforms for an economy that's been under a US trade embargo since 1960.
Now let's talk about tourism. So tourism is the most important sector of the Cuban economy. It's their most revenue-producing part of the economy as well. However, only 2.71% of all tourists going to Cuba are from the United States. And that's a problem for Cuba because they can really take advantage of that. So if there were a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Cuba, an additional 3 million tourists would be traveling to Cuba annually. That would benefit the hotel industry, the airline industry, the agriculture industry. As more people come to Cuba, they can't all stay in the hotels. They have to find local Cubans to stay with, generating revenue for local Cuban families who are poor right now. The agriculture industry will increase an estimated 20% as well, with more food demand.
Speaking of the increase in tourism, it's also important to know that Cuba, with the influx of more tourists into Cuba, it's important to realize that Cuba currently does not have the infrastructure needed to support that amount of influx of tourists. So it's something that has to be brought to light that they don't have the infrastructural capability at the moment to handle a large influx of tourists.
I would also like to point out that the United States as a country, we haven't abolished the United States and Cuba telecom industry overall. We have provided AT&T networks operation, and for facilitating that, we have made available the undersea cables from Florida to Cuba. And we make sure that the transition of routing the calls goes as smooth as possible.
But to the dismay, I feel that only 1% of the 6 million calls are being successfully routed. So I feel that's not a good successful rate in terms of the routing thing. So I feel if we have more FDI foreign direct investments after the US trade embargo is uplifted, that will bring about more telecom companies like maybe the T-Mobile, maybe the the Verizon or the Sprint, and that would open up a huge market for the Cuban industry, and that would benefit both the Cuban people who will be technologically more advanced to face the real world, and maybe that would help them coming out of their communist regime, which has just deteriorated them for the long 50 years from the US trade embargo.
I hear your point about that, and I do agree that both countries regarding the foreign direct investments need to work together, the US and Cuba.
Now, with the embargo currently in place, the Cuba really suffers medically. And let me give you an example why. A couple of years ago, it was reported by the Cuban government that there were 12 children, Cuban children, who needed to have heart surgery. And because the American-made catheters weren't able to arrive at Cuba on time, the surgeries had to be performed a different way. And 2 of those 12 children ended up dying due to that. That's an example that can be avoided without a trade embargo.
It's important. I am not in support of infantile death, but we have to look at the big picture here. Although you're looking at the issue with the catheters isolated, you also have to consider that there are other big products that also go into Cuba. And with this influx of medical products and medical services, you have to also consider that there is a important concept to think about here with the intellectual property laws. Yes, you might say that there are intellectual property laws in Cuba, but it's uncertain how well or how strictly these laws are going to be enforced. And it's unfair for those that have pioneered such medical breakthroughs not to reap the benefits of their work. So it's something that has to be addressed when it comes to opening the embargo and letting these products inflow into Cuba.
Sure, and the United States completely sympathize with the loss of infants due to the ignorance.
This year's annual trade fair has attracted some 1,500 firms from more than 60 countries. The United States is also here. Food sales are exempt from the trade embargo, and the US is Cuba's largest supplier of food.
Do you know that 60% of Cuba's oil demand relies on imports? And out of that, they're getting all those imports from only one country, Venezuela. Now that's a problem. Why? Venezuela currently is unstable politically, unpredictable economically. What happens if Venezuela goes downhill? What will Cuba do? They won't be able to get the oil that they depend on from Venezuela, and that could be a huge problem. GDP, which decreased by 34% when the Soviet Union went downhill, would be facing a similar situation.
It's important to know that also goes both ways. As much as you say that they're dependent on Venezuela for that oil, you also have to remember that Venezuela is also dependent on them to receive revenue from the oil that they ship to them. Currently, Venezuela ships 100,000 barrels of oil daily to Cuba. And I'm guessing that will amount to a revenue that Venezuela is not willing to give up readily at this moment.
But after the Fidel Castro's demise and after Raul Castro has come up, there has been a change in the flexibility. It's like they are more dependent on the Asian markets. It's like recently, in the last annual year, there has been a 1.03 million barrels of oil being exported from Cuba to Asian continents, mainly India and our other neighboring countries. So there has been an 11% increase, to be specific, and to to Cuba, to be specific, from Venezuela, the rate has fallen by around 12%. So I feel they are more diversifying their portfolio.
Right.
Venezuela is also looking at more diversification. They don't want to just be because they provide at a very subsidized price. So they are not looking only to Cuba. They are also now opening up more.
Sure. And let me add that America can help Cuba develop their alternative energy sources.
Sure. Speaking about economic progress, we also know that during the Fidel Castro's regime, what happened was there was an economic downturn, and it was almost that the economic progress was down by half, and that led to a lot of black market operations rather than the economic command line. So we know that there's a lot of infamous news in the market about the Venezuelan cross-border subsidy oil exports. United States we fear that these illegal activities can infiltrate the United States.
Okay. Also, another issue to be considered is security concerns with lifting the embargo. If the embargo is lifted, there's a possibility of the potential of feeling the impact of undesirable violent behavior. We're not sure to what capacity, but this could also be a concern if the embargo is lifted, given that it would allow the inflow of Cubans to the US and vice versa.
Let me add to that. We also fear that the revolutionary armed groups, and specifically the tensions which were post-embargo period, the Cold War tensions, they might be revived after the embargo is lifted up, and facilitating all the tourism and healthcare industry to be running in the free trade agreement. Right?
To be specific, exactly the intention was that Cuba was in support of Soviet Union, and that time there was a national security concern, and that led to the US-Cuba trade embargo. But in 1991, as you know, everybody knows, the Soviet Union got disintegrated. It has now been, there's everything okay with that. And the main intention of this embargo was that communism as a form of government should be demolished. But as you know, China is still there as the biggest communist country. And no way it has been successful for 50 years. So now I feel if we remove it, there's going to be some technical know-how that's going to be being transferred from Cuba, from US, maybe some intellectual and trade analysts are going to start it out, and there may be good life for the Cuban people, and as a whole, the US economy is also have a lot of exports.
I think we're convinced that the advantages definitely outweighs the disadvantage of lifting out the trade embargo against Cuba, and it definitely brings it top of the line in priority to enforce this sanction of free trade agreement. Therefore, we lift the embargo.
That's great.
There you go.
You should say it. Okay, fine. Oh, that's great.